Welcome everyone to this how to solve Punnett square or genetics problems. I'm going to go over the basic steps and then I'm going to do a practice problem together with you all here on the video. So first I want to review the steps to solving the genetics problems. These problems will always start off, you always need to start off with identifying the dominant and the recessive alleles in the problem. So we're always going to focus on just one trait, for example, hair color. And this trait could have many different alleles. We'll focus on traits where there's just two possible versions. And one of the versions is dominant, meaning that it is, you can think of it as stronger. It will show up. And the other version is recessive. It is, some people like to say it's weaker. I like to say it's the one that hides, it's hidden. And these are the two types of alleles. Once you have identified the dominant and recessive allele, you're going to then figure out the genotypes of the parents. And so genotypes, I want to write this down here. There's three possible genotypes that an organism can have. The organism can be what's called homozygous dominant, meaning it has two dominant versions of the gene or two dominant alleles. And let me just write this here. The dominant one always has the uppercase letter. The recessive one always uses a lowercase letter. So what are the genotypes? There could be homozygous dominant. There is heterozygous. And that's supposed to be a lowercase a. And heterozygous means that the organism has one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Notice there's an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter. And then there is the last genotype, which is homozygous recessive. Homozygous recessive is a organism that has two recessive alleles. Notice that they're both lowercase. All right, so next, you set up the Punnett square with the gametes or alleles of the parents. So first you had to figure out the genotypes. Parent number one could be this one, or this one. Parent number two could be this one, or this one. And you're going to take those alleles and you're just going to basically split them up. So if you take a look, let me change my color pen. I'll make it green this time. If you take a look down here at the alleles of the parents basically get split up. This question mark represents one of those letters and the other one represents the other letter. Parent number two, you'll do the same thing. You'll line them up along the side. You might be wondering, why are we splitting up the alleles? These alleles get split up because they represent the gametes of the parents. Gamete is just a fancy word for sex cell. And depending on the type of organism, for example, if it's an animal, the male organism will produce sperm cells and the female organism will produce egg cells. And so these just represent the possible alleles that the sperm or egg cells are carrying. And they only carry one allele for each trait rather than two. So why is the case? That's the case because the parents' alleles are then crossed and the boxes get filled in with the possible genotypes of the offspring. Let me erase this here. So if you take a look down in the Punnett square, these are all the possible combinations of alleles that the organism's offspring could inherit. Notice that I have one question mark of each color in each of the boxes. That shows us that the offspring or the possible offspring will inherit one allele from one parent and the other allele from the other parent. It will always be like that. That's why the gametes only have one allele each, because you need to get the correct number of alleles for every trait. Otherwise, the organism usually isn't even born, doesn't exist, or it has lots of problems or can't reproduce. But in a healthy organism, they will have inherited one allele from each parent. Once you have filled in the Punnett square, so you got all the possible combinations, you're then going to just write those out. And I will usually ask you for the fractions of each of the genotypes, meaning how many out of the four possible offspring inherited a homozygous dominant genotype. How many of the four inherited heterozygous genotype? And how many out of the four inherited a homozygous recessive genotype? You're going to use the genotype then to figure out the phenotype. So the phenotype is the physical characteristic of the organism. And the phenotypes always are based off of the genotype. So here is the practice problem from the Nearpod that I gave to you all. And it says, Mendel's pea plants are either tall or short. Cross a homozygous dominant parent with a homozygous recessive parent. And then the final question is, or this is the background information, and the actual question says, calculate the percent of tall and short offspring. So let's start off with setting it up. I need to identify which version of the trait is dominant and which one is recessive. And I'm just going to actually underline it because the practice problem gave us that information. Notice that tall is represented with an uppercase H, and short is represented with the lowercase h. This means that the tall trait or the tall allele is dominant. We always use uppercase letters to represent dominant alleles. And the short allele is recessive. We use lowercase letters to represent recessive alleles. Okay, so we identified. Tall is dominant, short is recessive. Next, let's identify the genotypes of the parents. And I'm going to actually write them in up here. We have a homozygous dominant parent. So homozygous dominant parent. And let me get another color for the other parents. And then a homozygous recessive parent. Let's start off with the first one. Parent number one is homozygous dominant. Homozygous dominant means it has the word homozygous, homo meaning two of the same. And in this case, it's two of the same dominant alleles. So I know parent number one must be, let me just write it right here, homozygous dominant, which is two uppercase H's. Homozygous dominant. Parent number two is homozygous recessive. Homozygous meaning two of the same alleles. In this case, two of the same recessive alleles. So the second parent is going to have two recessive alleles. They are two lowercase h's. So this means that parent number one must be tall and parent number two must be short. So then now let's go ahead and set up our Punnett square. I'm going to use red to represent the first parent and blue to represent the second parent. So parent number one has this genotype. In order to set up the Punnett square, I just take each allele and just separate it. I'm going to put this one up here at the top. So here are the two alleles from parent number one. Parent number 1 only produces gametes with dominant alleles in them. So parent number 1 can only pass on a dominant allele to its offspring because that's all it has in its genotype. Let's set up parent number 2. Parent number 2 is homozygous recessive. It has 2 recessive alleles. So let's write those here along the side. Notice that the gametes, the sex cells of parent number 2, only have recessive alleles in them. And that's because parent number 2 only has recessive alleles. It doesn't have another kind of allele to pass on to its offspring. So then now comes the distributing part. We're going to distribute these alleles into the boxes of the Punnett square. So I'm going to start off with this first allele of parent number 1. I'm going to distribute it down to the boxes below. And I'm going to do the same thing for its other allele. Notice that I'm writing the uppercase H towards the left side of each box because we always write uppercase letters first. Parent number 2 has recessive alleles. So let's start off with this first recessive allele. If this gamete carrying this recessive allele fertilizes this other gamete of the other parent, the offspring will end up with this genotype. Heterozygous, 1 dominant, 1 recessive. If that gamete fertilizes the other gametes of the parent, then you end up with this genotype. So notice how I just carried it across. I'm going to do the same thing with its other allele. Carry it across and carry it across. All right. So we filled in our Punnett squares. And take a look. Every single offspring here has the same possible genotype. This homozygous dominant parent and homozygous recessive parent can only produce one type of offspring, one type of genotype in their offspring. So this question that says calculate the percent of tall and short offspring, let's first write down, and I'm going to use the text box now, just because I like to, this one I'm going to be writing down words instead. Let's get it to fit. Right here. All right, so what is the genotypes of the offspring? I'm going to write all the genotypes I see here. The offspring only have, so the offspring genotypes, or the possible genotypes of the offspring are big H, little h. Those are the only genotypes that are possible. It's the only genotype possible for these offspring. And so let me go back to writing here. And this genotype, I'm going to change the color just so it stands out. Oops. This genotype, oh, can I not change it? I guess not. This genotype is heterozygous. And let me just put that in quotations. Heterozygous. It's heterozygous because it has one of each allele. It has a dominant and a recessive allele. So the possible genotypes of the offspring are big H, little h. The possible phenotypes of the offspring are, so if we look at this genotype, it's big H, little h. Is that going to give us tall plants or short plants? To answer this, we need to note that the uppercase H is dominant. That means that allele is the one that's going to determine the phenotype. And I can see that the uppercase H represents tall plants or tall allele. So since all of the offspring are heterozygous, that means all of the offspring must be tall plants. And here again, all of the offspring have the exact same genotype. They all have the exact same phenotype. So to answer the question, I can say 100% are tall plants and 0% are short plants. Again, why is this the case? This is the case because from the Punnett square, you can see that the only combination of genotypes for the offspring that results here is heterozygous. Heterozygous means one dominant and one recessive allele. This dominant and recessive allele results in the phenotype of being tall because the tall allele is dominant. And so if there's at least one dominant allele, that's the trait that's going to show up. So 100% of these offspring will be tall, 0% will be short. That's the correct answer there. So the reason I made this video is so that you can rewatch it as many times as you need to in order to figure out how to set up the Punnett square problems. The most important thing is knowing how to set this up and knowing how to fill in the Punnett squares. Notice that this is just one example. There could be different alleles for parents. I could have had heterozygous parents. Here I had homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. So there's many different examples. So that's why we're going to keep on practicing. If any of you need help at all, please make sure that you reach out to me, come to tutoring on Thursdays, or come to office hours on Monday. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.